What is some creepy piece of folklore? My hometown is named for the freshwater springs that bubble up everywhere in the woods around town. Obviously this was a perk for early people living there, and so the original settlers were surprised to see that the local Ojibwe avoided the area. They did this because they had a folk memory about a bad spirit that possessed members of the tribe, starting with children, and compelled them to enter into the springs and drown themselves. Naturally they have a prophecy about it, too. One day or another, they say, the springs will open again. Our village has one called Bylas. What makes it creepy is that she isn't some obscure, unidentified being. People know women who are called Bylas, they have normal families and stuff. So she's literally living amongst you. She stalks people at night, that's when she's usually in a ghoulish form, feet turned backwards and shit. She gets sick a day before someone in the vicinity is about to die, and then becomes very healthy the day they do die. She can turn into different creatures and attack you while you're alone. Then you will fall sick, and if she visits you in her human form while you're sick, you'll die. And you can't refuse her coming in. Sounds silly, and it is, but it is still creepy. And there's another one about music of the dead. Our traditional music has flutes and some forms of drums in it. It's said that people will often hear the music coming from the distance, but the flute will be missing. You're supposed to ignore it because that's the music of dead/otherworldly beings. If you don't ignore it, then they'll notice you too. We have a lot of weird stuff like that. I guess people had to have good stories to keep themselves entertained. Edit. Thanks for the great response, guys. I'm glad you like the stories. Hunza has a lot of interesting folklore, and I'm glad I was able to share some with such a nice crowd. When I lived in an Australian outback town in the middle of nowhere, our Indigenous Studies teacher, who is Aboriginal, loved to tell us stories. She scared all the first graders straight by telling us never to go out into the desert alone, because there lives a monster who is always thirsty. He's always trying to find water, but never can because it hardly rains. So when plump and juicy children become lost in the desert, he jumps on them and drinks all their blood. All he leaves behind are the dry husks of children for their parents to find. I am sure she was just trying to deter us from wandering off into the bushland, but it left a memorable imprint. I've forgotten the monster's name. Another popular Aboriginal tale is the Tidalik. Tidalik was a giant frog who drank all the water in the world. As the other creatures began to die from thirst, they plotted to make Tidalik laugh. Everyone failed except Nabunam, the eel, who danced and tied himself into knots. Tidalik laughed uproariously, releasing all the water and filling the rivers and lakes. Many of the creatures drowned in the process or were left stranded on new islands. The concept of a giant, laughing frog scared the cookies off me as a 6-year-old. Pokong. They're wrapped corpses who hop because their feet are bound, and if one finds you it will follow you across the earth. Edit. I made this post on mobile while trying to fall asleep, LMAO, so I left out a lot of stuff. I've read that it's an Indonesian/Singaporean ghost. A few people have already said it, but they're wrapped for burial rites, and they're not malevolent in the slightest. They actually wander in search of someone to untie the top of the wrapping so they can pass on to the afterlife, and once they find someone they will follow that particular person until untied. The Pokong is commonly described as having a pale green, shriveled and decaying face, with 2 deep empty holes where its eyes should be, and while it usually does the small hops it's capable of leaping 50 meters. Like someone else said, it can also fly or teleport. While not threatening and certainly not as scary as some things on this list, the Pokong has always been one of the creepiest/most unsettling thing I can imagine. Scariest one I've heard in real life? The cave people. If you explore caves you've probably heard them. The quiet little whispers. They sound like a group talking way off in the impenetrable darkness. I've heard a dozen different versions of what they are. Lost souls, dwarves, evil spirits, or the logical explanation, drops of water echoing in your mind playing tricks. Either way, it's a common joke that we all carry 3 sources of light so that it never goes out. Because if it does, they'll come for you. Or it's because it's true darkness down there and you'll likely get lost and fall in a pit. It's a rite of passage for young cavers to be frightened with the stories by older vets. Though I've met a few who really swear to having full conversations with the specters. No matter how you shake it, I'm a giant wimp and still don't like caving alone or getting too far from my group. Or turning my light out for more than a few minutes. The flying head. In Malaysia we called it penanggal. 'Cause it basically a detached head that flew around in the night, seeking for blood of a woman who recently gave birth. The head is floating with its lungs and throat dangling below its neck. When morning comes, the head will flew back and attach to its body. Usually it is some form of black magic that were practiced by people who want to maintain their youth. Most of the ghosts in Malaysia were fairly similar to Indonesia. You can see lots of example if you search for the video game called Dread Out. Local legend from my area pretty common, you pick someone up, and they turn out to be a ghost. Only problem is it used to be a well-known road out in the boonies, only happened on certain nights of the year. And literally everyone avoided it because virtually everyone knew someone who had picked the ghost up at some point. Something happened like she would start screaming and then vanish. Then one day construction began on the road, because the place is so small people from out of town started working on the road, and a news story came out about how a girl got in a car with them and then vanished sometime through the night, just before screaming. The time of year wasn't around Halloween or anything. Literally when we were younger and out, riding bikes at night, one night it got a little too late and we caught hell for it because my cousin lived within about 15 to 20 minutes of that place. Literally his parents jumped our cases because of the ghost. The road is gone now because quite literally no one used it. I'm from northern Brazil near the Amazon River. My grandma always told us the story of the Matita Pereira. At night you can hear her whistle. She is like a witch, if she finds you in the forest she gonna beat you with a leash that she has. The Matita Pereira is a normal human in daylight, she can be anyone from the village. It is like a curse. When you hear her whistle you can call her 3 times. You would scream, "Matita, come drink coffee," in the next morning she would visit you in her human form to drink coffee with you. So you could find out who she is. But there is a catch. She would come real early in the morning. You should have coffee and cigar for her, otherwise she would kill you. Everybody who would still be asleep when she arrives, would fall ill and die. It was really creepy for me growing up. But today I know that the whistle is a bird. In Brazil we have a lot of those folklore stories. This wasn't folklore, but my friend's uncle told us a story that's creeped me out ever since I heard it. He was telling us how he used to work a large farm in Mexico when he was younger and he had only been there for about 2 months. At one end of the farm was an older house with dark trees all around it and he noticed that the animals never went to that side and he would always see someone walking back and forth at the edge of the fence. Like they wanted in. One day the animals went to that side so he went over there too and he could see the person passing back and forth. As he got closer he noticed it was a woman because her hair was really long and dropped in front of her face. As he walked up to introduce himself her head shot up and she stared at him with completely black eyes. He said her face resembled a horse's because it was so long and disfigured. As he backed away she started to climb the fence and then chased him. She chased him all the way to his house which was about 1 mile away. He never went back to work. This is technically not a folklore or story, but it is based on a well-known, I'd say globally known, folklore. It also happens to be one of my all-time favorite short stories. Nicholas was older than sin, and his beard could grow no whiter. He wanted to die. The dwarfish natives of the Arctic caverns did not speak his language, but conversed in their own, twittering tongue, conducted incomprehensible rituals, when they were not actually working in the factories. Once every year they forced him, sobbing and protesting, into endless night. During the journey he would stand near every child in the world, leave one of the dwarves' invisible gifts by its bedside. The children slept, frozen into time. He envied Prometheus and Loki, Sisyphus and Judas. His punishment was harsher. Ho. 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 / Neil Gaiman and #X200B, I just wanted to share its splendor with all of you. Talipo. American folk legend about a giant cat-like creature that stalks the woods at night. In the original legend, an old hermit hunter shoots it, misses, and instead ends up shooting its tail off. Talipo is startled and manages to escape. Satisfied with the tail, the hunter takes it home to make stew out of it. Later that night Talipo manages to break into his home. Talipo jumps on the man's bed and asks where its Talipo is. The man, scared shitless, answers that he ate it. Talipo is enraged, and as an act of vengeance claws the man's stomach out and destroys his house to rubble. In some children's versions the hunter only loses his house, but most versions include a hunting dog that also dies in the scuffle. Other versions also have the legend last for a few days rather than one night, where the hunter is stalked by the creature every night, but the basic story is still the same. First time I heard it as a kid I was living in Alabama and it scared the absolute shit out of me since my grandma's house was right in front of a huge plot of woods. It's easy to imagine horror and folklore legends from other countries miles away, but the local stuff freaks me out. The Drog of Norwegian Folklore. Norway is a country that has a giant coastline, with cold seas and plenty of storms, so naturally one of our creepiest pieces of folklore would be based around it. The Drog is the spirit of a sailor taken by storms. Their ships were shattered, and their bodies pulled beneath the waves, never to set foot on land again. Now they sail within the storm in their broken boats, bodies cold and bloated, covered in seaweed and barnacles. If you find your vessel trapped in a terrible storm you might see one, and if you do you will never set foot on land again. The Drog will come out of the storm, grab hold of you, and drag you into your watery grave. Edit, just thought I'd mention that there is in fact a connection between the Drog and the Draugr. They both originate from the same area and have variations that are almost identical. However, the modern Drog is a roughly 1500s to 1700s invention that takes inspiration from the Old Norse Draugr. The Draugr lives in burial mounds, guarding its treasure and cursing people. The Drog lives in stormy seas and curses people. The Drog that live in the sea are also referred to in English as sea Drog to avoid the confusion. As a Trinidadian, growing up we were told not to go wandering off into the forests. Duins lived in the forests, and were basically children that had their feet back to front. Once they learned a child's name, they would call out to them in the voice of the parents, leading them into the forests. Their footprints would lead the child more astray, losing them in the forests for good. They are said to be lost souls of kids. That's just one weird folklore we have, whereas we have many. I wish I can list them all for you guys. I was reading a book on Finnish folklore and was surprised when the most brutal story was about tontis, gnomes, elves, homekeepers. In modern world they're often described in an affectionate way, but they used to be some malevolent creepers. People believed in tontis for a very long time. It was said they only really disappeared alongside electric lighting in households because there were no more dark corners for tontis to hide in. They were described as scary-looking creatures, sometimes originating from the previous dead owners of the house. Tontis kept the house safe and thriving as long as you left them food, and in this story the last session of sauna. You weren't supposed to go to sauna after midnight because that's when it's Tontis' turn. Well, there was a cheeky wench who gave a rat's ass about this rule and decided to go anyway. Everyone was telling her not to, but she was stubborn. Time passes and there's no word of the wench. The people go to see if she's still in there, but all that's left of her is her flayed skin hanging on a perch. Some traditionally creepier stuff are likios, who are the lost souls of children who have been buried and hidden in the woods after childbirth, no christening. They scared people by crying and screaming, but sometimes they were helpful and pointed out trees that were about to fall. Sometimes they're described the same as vervacheli, will-o-wisp, and lure people deeper into bogs and forests. Painajainen, also the Finnish word for nightmare, literally translated it would be something like the one who presses, painoa equals press, was a creature who sat on a sleeping person's chest, caused bad dreams and scared the bejesus out of them. Later it's been determined it was an explanation for sleep paralysis. I think I would go with the Rattenfänger von Hameln. It is a German tale. There is this man who comes into a town which is filled with rats. He offers the villagers his help. They take his offering and promise him a fair payment. So he walks around town playing flute. He plays it so well that every rat leaves its hiding spot to follow him. He walks out of town and brings the rats away. After this he returns, demanding his payment. The villagers are afraid of him and refuse to pay. They even try to force him away. He leaves before he gets harmed. One night when the moon was at its highest he came back and walked around town one more time, playing the flute. This time every child at the town comes outside to see him playing. The kids love his play, so they follow him around. So this man wanders around until he has every single child in town in his tracks and he leaves. The next morning the parents wake to see every kid gone. No one could find them and no one heard of him anymore.